Good afternoon, everybody. I welcome you on this very, very beautiful afternoon in the dark and fuzzy, as I suggested, digital boudoir, as the lighting is a little capricious, and unfortunately this is what we have, but I think we'll make do. It is a great pleasure to introduce the inaugural lecture in a semesterly series of talks in the new area at the UConn Humanities Institute, Digital Humanities and Media Studies. As indicated on our website, DHMS seeks to engage the UConn community in debates, explorations, and exchange on all aspects related to digital humanities and media studies. In fact, these sister fields are uniquely in dialogue at UConn, with faculty and students already working either in one or both, displaying an interdisciplinary and international richness of scholarly inquiry, experimentation, and publication. And Ellen confirmed that, in fact, the marriage of digital humanities and media studies is unique, so we can engage with that and celebrate. And the Humanities Institute, thank you very much. Its goal is to foster this dialogue by offering talks, supporting and organizing events and reading groups, and bringing the DHMS community at UConn together. There's no scholar, and I really would like to emphasize that, to begin this DHMS series of talks than let me start over. There's no scholar better suited to begin this DHMS series of talks than Professor Alan Liu, a pioneer in both digital humanities and media or new media studies, who from the very beginning of humanities computing, as it used to be called, engaged the critical side as well as the practical one. It is a great honor to welcome you to the UConn campus, Alan.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
And our colleague, Yohei Igarashi from the English department will introduce Professor Liu's talk on Toward Critical Infrastructure Studies in greater detail, and shed light on Professor Liu's multifold work. Please help yourself to coffee and cookies in the back. And as we switch speakers, thank you again, and please welcome Yohei.
I'm very happy to introduce Professor Alan Liu today. He is professor in the English department at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an affiliated faculty member of UCSB's Media Arts and Technology graduate program. And previously, he was an associate professor in Yale University's English department and a member of the British Studies program there. Professor Liu's research began in the field of British Romantic literature and art. His first book, Wordsworth, The Sense of History, from 1989, explored the relation between the imaginative experiences of literature and history. And I should say that one of my best memories of grad school involved this book, where a few of us in a graduate seminar wanted to discuss longer than the seminar time allowed, chapter 2 of that work, and also its very long footnotes. And so an extra seminar meeting was scheduled where the four of us most interested in this puzzled over this dense but also rewarding chapter, paragraph by paragraph, and footnote by footnote, and also Althusser too, to make things more difficult. And if you know this work, the footnotes themselves are these luminous miniature essays in their own right, and this was, weirdly enough, one of my favorite memories from grad school. After the Wordsworth study, Liu wrote a series of theoretical essays on cultural criticism, the new historicism, and postmodernism in contemporary literary studies. These essays include The Power of Formalism, The New Historicism from 1989, Local Transcendence, Cultural Criticism, Postmodernism, and The Romanticism of Detail from 1990. And a series of later essays extend these concerns, but bring them to bear more specifically on the future of literature, or as he calls it, the future literary, and the humanities, and maybe the future humanities too, in the culture of information and post-industrial knowledge work. And these concerns culminate in the laws of cool, knowledge work, and the culture of information from 2004. Many of Professor Liu's other essays from the 90s and the 2000s are also gathered in a collection called Local Transcendence, Essays on Postmodern Historicism and the Database. As Anka alluded to all the while, Professor Liu was a pioneer in digital humanities before there was or were digital humanities. In 1994, he started his Voice of the Shuttle website, which some of you may have visited, a very well-curated clearinghouse of humanities resources and humanities research. He also founded the NEH-funded project called Transcriptions, as well as his English department's undergraduate specialization on literature and the culture of information. From 2002 to 2007, he was also a member of the board of directors of the Electronic Literature Organization, and other digital initiatives or projects include Transliteracies, ROSE, Research-Oriented Social Environment, and many, many more. Also, he currently maintains this invaluable wiki called DH Toy Chest, which is this really useful collection of explanations, tools, and data sets, really a starter kit for digital humanities projects. And it's very generous. I think it's publicly accessible. Professor Liu, in one of the footnotes to the Wordsworth book, writes that with regard to both formalism and the new historicism, quote, I am both implicated and critical. The same goes with his work in digital humanities, implicated and critical, and really in the thick of it all. He participates in, explicates, and theorizes the digital humanities like no one else, and his celebrated recent essays include The State of the Digital Humanities, a report and a critique, Where is Cultural Criticism in the Digital Humanities, and finally, The Meaning of the Digital Humanities from 2013. And one or many of these, or sometimes all of them, are typically found on every digital humanities syllabus, which is a very reassuring thought. The last thing I'll say is that Professor Liu is also a very nice guy. He really made my month, January 2015, which was the month of the MLA in Vancouver, where he came up to me after a paper I gave and said very nice words. And also similarly, more recently at UC Santa Barbara last March, when he went out of his way to say nice things about an essay I had written. So, very nice person on top of all of his accomplishments. As Anka said, there's no better person to inaugurate the speaker series for the DHMS program within the Humanities Institute, because Professor Liu's work has advocated all along a better integration of digital humanities and media studies. So this program would probably not have assumed the form that it has. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alan Liu.
Introduction, and Dante as well. And of course, thank you for inviting me here. It's my first time to Stores. Even though I spent all those years, first as an undergraduate and then a assistant associate professor at Yale, one just never had any reason, I guess, at that time to come up to Stores. So here I am. I bring greetings from one of your best undergraduate graduates recently, Georgina Paella, who is now in my Introduction to Digital Humanities graduate seminar, is doing a great job. One of the assignments for the course is to publish 2 to 3 blog posts on a research topic. She's just put out her first one, and it's gotten really good reviews online from Miriam Posner and others in the DH community. I'm especially pleased to be here because of the quite unique, as Anke said, and innovative nature of your intent to fuse together and interweave the digital humanities and new media studies, or media studies, as in the certificate of that title, which is just getting underway right now. There aren't that many other formal efforts to bring those two inflections of the field together. The fields are slightly different for a number of institutional, technological, and social reasons. Though many people inhabit both fields or are collaborators with people in the other branch of the field, there are relatively few programs, centers, institutes, editions, anthologies, conferences that are dedicated to bringing those two sets of people together. You'll see, as a matter of fact, as I continue talking, that my perspective today will be primarily from the point of view of the digital humanities, but with some allusion to the, at times, convergence of the perspective of the new media studies people, and also sometimes a divergence of their perspective as well. So you'll see that the two camps flicker in and out of alignment with each other in my talk. This is a new venture for me. I'm gradually incubating and working up this topic today, and forming some alliances with people in this country and currently in England as well to see if we can bring this topic forward. Let me set the foundation first. My topic today is infrastructure, or accurately, since there's no infrastructure except as viewed from a certain perspective, my topic is infrastructure from the point of view of the digital humanities, and secondarily, new media studies. A prevalent contemporary understanding of the humanities and arts, here with apologies to Matthew Arnold, is that their highest mission is to interpret the best and worst which has been thought and said in culture, with the critical end not just of knowing, but of ethically evaluating and acting, sometimes today to the point of social activism. If that's the case, then the question has been asked, sometimes quite pointedly, as in the Los Angeles Review of Books last year, how well, if at all, do the digital humanities contribute to the humanities mission, as opposed simply to merging the humanities into neoliberal knowledge work? The most constructive way to address this question, I think, is to realize that it's actually a muddle of two questions. The unintelligent or misinformed one is, can or should digital humanists be doing interpretation and critique in common with other humanists? And the answer to that is simply yes, though a more detailed answer would need to drill down into how the very notions of interpretation and critique are shifting today, as their scholarly primitives, protocols of evidence, pattern finding, description, representation, comparison, etc., are shifting in the digital era. The more productive, sharply focused question, I think, is the following, and I really believe that the digital humanists would take heed to consider this carefully. What kind of critical interpretation is uniquely appropriate and purposive for the digital humanities? That is, what kinds of interpretation and critique not only allow digital humanities to join up with leading modes of humanities research, but could not be conducted except through digital humanities methods that lead in their own domain. That being to use technology self-reflexively as part of the very knowledge and not just as the instrument for researching and acting ethically on important issues. I suspect there are going to be several kinds of major answers to that latter question, including the potential of digital humanities in collaboration with new media studies to address issues such as big data and algorithmic culture. But the answer I pose today is that the digital humanities are uniquely placed to interpret and critique culture at the level of infrastructure. For infrastructure, the social cum technological milieu that at once enables the fulfillment of human experience and enforces constraints on that experience, today has much of the same scale, complexity, and general cultural impact as the idea of culture itself. Indeed, it may be that in late modernity, the experience of infrastructure at institutional scales, undergirded by national or regional infrastructures such as electricity grids and global scale infrastructures such as the internet, is operationally the experience of culture. Put another way, the word infrastructure can now give us the same kind of general purchase on social complexity that Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, and others sought when they reached for their all-purpose word a few generations ago, culture. Consider the way that dystopian films produced at the onset of the digital information age, such as Blade Runner, on the left there, in 1982, and the Mad Max films beginning in 1979. Can you see that okay? Roughly. You can see that okay if you've already seen the movies. That's what the answer is. Consider the way that they characterize whole cultures by foregrounding infrastructure. In the former, glistening noir cityscapes defined by transportation and media technology, in the latter, desert landscapes defined by fuel and water supply systems. Those films gave a taste of the way late modern infrastructure, and indeed landscape and environment as interwoven with infrastructure, is increasingly the mise-en-scène of culture. As Rosalind Williams wrote in her influential 1993 essay, boy, that's not very good at all, titled Cultural Origins and Environmental Implications of Large Technological Systems, infrastructure is, quote, the outstanding feature of the modern cultural landscape. What human values and relationships are represented in the cultural landscape of the late 20th century, she asked, especially in the dominance of pathways over settlements, close quote. Her article is primarily about the dominance today, the hegemony of roads and transportation infrastructure in lieu, as it were, of places as they used to be known. Not just filmic near future or post-apocalyptic fantasy life, in other words, but daily life in our modern cultural landscapes. Driving, for example, steeps us in pervasive encounters with transportation media and other infrastructures. These do not just neutrally convey the experience of culture, but are visibly parts of our cultural experience. Late modernity is thus car culture, cable TV culture. I guess I have to update that now to Netflix culture, internet culture, smartphone culture, and any other kind of cool culture. Or as I studied in my book, The Laws of Cool, cool is a cultural affect of both smart technologies and the knowledge workers who use them to be, or at least look, smart. Cool, as it were, is transport in a different sense, an engineered Zen, transporting us not out of daily life, but deeper into its habituated routines, secretly yearning for enlightenment. The consequence of such convergence between infrastructure and the experience of culture for humanistic critique may, I think, be predicted as follows. Especially in the digital humanities, critique must now begin to focus on infrastructure in order to have any hope of creating tomorrow's equivalents of the great cultural critical statements of the past. Tomorrow's E.T. Thompson writing about the making of the working class, C. Wright Mills about white collars, Raymond Williams about culture and society, Michel Foucault about discipline, Judith Butler about gender and performativity, Donna Haraway obviously about cyborgs, or Homi Bhabha about hybridity, among many others who could be cited. They will need to include in their works attention to infrastructure as that cyborg being whose making, working, disciplining, performance, gendering, and hybridity are increasingly part of the core identity of late modern culture in ways no longer fully describable in older schemes of ideology critique, according to which infrastructure underlies an alternate rather than thoroughly intermeshed reality of superstructure. Superstructure, I think, has now become compressed into infrastructure and vice versa, where, and this is a signposting toward argument to come in this talk, the zone of compression, I think, is increasingly structured by modern organizational institutions in which we are fully enmeshed or wired. So the next section of my talk is titled Support Beam 1 Method. What would the method for a digital humanities cultural criticism focused on infrastructure look like? To give it a colorful name, I imagine the method supporting such criticism would be agile. I borrow this adjective from a contemporary approach to software development that, considered technically, is rapid, ad hoc, and incremental, and considered socially is iterative, adaptable, and collaborative, epitomized in so-called agile software development scrums with their rapid burst sprints of collaborative work. Now, this next paragraph is not fully worked out. I haven't laid in the research that I've done yet, but frankly, I'm not very happy with the hyper-masculinist metaphor of the scrum for this kind of collaborative digital work. I did a lot of research one time for another article that I've not completed yet on this, which I think is a much better metaphor, and that is a quilting bee. The history of American patchwork quilting is really quite interesting when you look at it in conjunction with the modern industrial development and the Great Depression when it got its great popular burst of activity here. This is a much better context for two reasons. One is it's truer to our modern notion of open collaborative work, as emphasized by the adoption of the patchwork quilting and related metaphors, the mosaic and kaleidoscope in research about diversity and multiculturalism a decade or so ago. And also it has a genealogical relationship to computational work, starting with Jacquard's loom, as you know, which was programmed to weave fabrics together by means of punch cards, an idea that then Charles Babbage borrowed for his analytical engine and his difference engine. When you look at the iconography of today's software development scrums, as they're called, you realize that those punch cards that program the collaborative work of the teams by way of a detour through the Japanese Kanban system of card-tagged bins, etc., have evolved into, for example, Trello team collaboration interfaces such as the one on the right that actually look a lot, not just like Kanban cards, but patchwork quilts. Okay, end of that interesting little detour there. In other words, not great systems of software formally modeled to Neoplatonic specs by gigantic top-down consortiums, but scrums and quilting parties of rapid release, results-oriented and adaptive software issued informally by teams. I think that's how the kind of cultural critique of infrastructure will need to proceed in the digital humanities. Less colorfully, the style of digital humanities infrastructural critique, I imagine, one that takes advantage of modes of thinking already prevalent in the field, may be called, and I apologize for the intentionally boring nature of this word after the quilting and scrum metaphors, lightly anti-foundationalist. The question that I concoct this admittedly prosaic phrase to answer is how much anti-foundationalism, or perhaps anti-groundwork, to allude to Marx's Grundrisse for a critique of political economy, is actually useful for critical infrastructural studies. Mainstream humanistic critique has often been anti-foundationalist all the way down, according to a three-stage logic that might be simplified as follows. And here I point out that my argument is roughly consonant with Rita Felsky's recent critique, which she conducts in part by reading the spatial, and I would call them infrastructural tropes, according to which critics dig down into gaps and fissures or stand back or above it all. In its first logical moment, critique often recognizes that the real, the true, or lawful groundwork that is infrastructure for anything, especially the things that matter most to people, such as the allocation of goods or the assignation of identity, is ungrounded. For example, while there are material reasons for resource allocation and the social relations of force needed to do that dirty deed, that is for political economy and society, any particular political economy and society are arbitrary and thus, in the last analysis, unjust. Political economy and society are thus not grounds, but to play on the word, precisely groundworks, particular ways of working the ground, that is a mode of production, supported by discursive, epistemic, psychic, and cultural institutions for ensuring that the work continues in the absence of any rational or moral justification. In its second logical moment, this really happened beginning in the post-May 1968 moment, beginning in France, but also in the New Historicism. Critique then goes anti-foundationalist to the second degree by criticizing its own standing in the political economic system. A recursion effect attested in now familiar worries that critics themselves are complicit in elitism, embourgeoisement, recuperation, containment, majoritarian identity, and tenure. Finally, in its third logical moment, and this is somewhat more modern than that post-May 1968 worry about embourgeoisement that I just referred to, critique seeks to turn its complicity to advantage. For example, by positioning critics as what Foucault called embedded or specific intellectuals, acting on a particular institutional scene to steer social forces. A related idea is to go tactical in the manner theorized by Michel de Certeau, who argued that people immured in any system can appropriate that system's infrastructure through bottom-up agency for deviant purposes. And you'll recall the beginning paradigm in his book, which is about jaywalking in the city. Media critics, including new media critics, have adapted Desserteau's notion in the name of tactical media. My colleague at Santa Barbara, Rita Raley, has a book on that topic, for example. Meaning media, whose platforms, channels, and interfaces, the whole of what Lisa Parks and Nicole Starosolsky have recently called media infrastructures, can be appropriated by users for alternative ends. So the people who study tactical media in the media sphere study things that extend from pirate radio toward alternative minimal computing interfaces today, many other not quite mainstream uses of informational technologies. From that total three-part logic of critique that I've just outlined, we can observe that the digital humanities often tend to slice out just the latter tactical moment. Such slicing, hacking critique to sever its roots from purist anti-foundationalism, brings the digital humanities into the orbit of several late or post-critical approaches with a similar style rather than full-blown theory, precisely because they eschew foundational purity. One approach that James Smithies has associated with the digital humanities is post-foundationalism, as he calls it. Borrowing from the philosopher of science, Dmitry Ginev, Smithies argues that post-foundationalism is, quote, an intellectual position that balances a distrust of grand narrative with an acceptance that methods honed over centuries and supported by independently verified evidence can lead, if not to truth itself, then closer to it than we were before. You see, he's trying to have his cake, the cake being truth, and to eat it too, to hollow out its absolute foundation. Post-foundationalism is thus well matched to the digital humanities. Smithies suggests if we think of the digital humanities as, quote, a process of continuous methodological and theoretical refinement that produces research outputs as snapshots of an ongoing activity, rather than the culmination of completed research, close quote. A related idea is critical technical practice, which Michael Dieter, building on Philip Agrer's writings on artificial intelligence research, makes a goal of the digital humanities. Dieter quotes from Agrer, and I'm quoting here, "The word critical here does not call for pessimism and destruction, but rather for an expanded understanding of the conditions and goals of technical work. Instead of seeking foundations, it would embrace the impossibility of foundations, guiding itself by a continual unfolding awareness of its own workings as a historically specific practice," close quote. And that's not a surprising statement from a humanist or from a social scientist, but from someone in computer science in the engineering domain, that's a surprising statement. Other ideas that are lightly anti-foundationalist in this way, though not to my knowledge yet applied to the digital humanities, include David Barry's notion of tactical infrastructures, about which he's been blogging, Bruno Latour's notion of compositionism, fixed on neither absolute foundations of knowledge nor absolute refutations of such foundations, but instead on mixed, impure, make-do and can-do compositions, as he calls it, of multiple positions. And I like this quite a bit, Akbar Abbas's notion of what he terms poor theory, which uses tools at hand and limited resources, I'm quoting here, to engage with heterogeneous probings, fragmentary thinking, and open-endedness in resistance to totalization, restriction, and closure, close quote. So poor theory in the sense of what the poor man has in terms of theoretical instruments that has to be cobbled together to serve the purpose. Also important is the recent emergence of feminist digital humanities approaches to infrastructure, as in the panel at DH 2016 last year on creating feminist infrastructure in the digital humanities, which featured Susan Brown, Tanya Clement, Laura Mandel, Deb Verhoeven, and Jackie Verneman. Applying feminist principles in a way that's consonant with what I've termed lightly anti-foundationalist here, the participants ask in their panel abstract, quote, how can digital infrastructure, as technologies of connection, support complex, non-binary understanding, close quote. Non-binariness in feminist theory applied in digital humanities stands for what I've been terming light anti-foundationalism. Or as Verhoeven puts it in a really quite brilliant, I recommend it strongly, essay of the same year titled, As Luck Would Have It, Serendipity and Solace in Digital Research Infrastructure, she writes, quote, a feminist digital archive would replace a technical ontology built on balanced binary narratives with a set of principles that allow for the discernment of conflicting, asymmetrical, and incomplete vantage points, close quote. All these lightly anti-foundationist approaches that I've just reviewed here, it may be noted, are tactical rather than strategically pure because their very potential for critique arises from dirty hands' proximity to and sometimes even partnership with their objects of critique. So implicated but critical, as Yoshi said. As in the case of the Devil's Bridges that Verhoeven makes her fable, such approaches have to at least get near the devil's work to see the infrastructure. Unlike distantiated critique in what Felsky calls its stand-back mode, that is, tactical critique, as the root of the word tactic might indicate, makes contact. Smithies thus notes post-foundationalism's function as what he terms a bridging concept, nice dovetailing with Verhoeven there, for what he calls the interdependence and entanglement of the digital humanities with post-industrialism. Indeed, I add that all the approaches thus far mentioned as a light foundation for critical infrastructure studies are similarly contaminated by the double principle of efficiency and flexibility, which, as I've articulated in my Laws of Cool book, is the two-stroke engine of the post-industrial mode of production. As it were, all the approaches I've mentioned are instances of lean and just-in-time critique, and thus not dissimilar in spirit to the in-house critique that post-industrial corporations at the end of the 20th century began to design into their own production lines by famously empowering workers to stop the line ad hoc, or less catastrophically, to suggest incremental improvements, a kind of post-industrial version of the serendipitous approach to infrastructure that Verhoeven scrutinizes in her essay. Such dirty contact with post-industrialism is both the weakness and the strength of lightly anti-foundationist approaches. For weakness means being swallowed up by the system, and strength comes from getting close enough to the system, to its devil's work, to know its critical points of inflection, difference, and change. If, as Smithy says, the digital humanities are deeply entangled in post-industrialism, in other words, entanglement need not be the same as equivalence, it is also non-binaristic engagement. So now the critical potential of light anti-foundationalism in the digital humanities, criticism light, as it were, can be stated. I think it's precisely the ability to treat infrastructure not as a foundation or anti-foundation, but instead as a nuanced, non-binaristic tactical medium that opens the possibility of a critical infrastructure studies, as I and others have begun calling this possibly emergent field. It is such critical infrastructure studies, operating as a mode of cultural studies, that will allow the digital humanities to fulfill one of their most needed critical functions at the present time, which I believe is to help adjudicate how academic infrastructure connects higher education to, but also differentiates it from, the workings of other institutions in advanced technological societies. The critical function of the digital humanities going forward, in other words, is to assist in the shaping of smart, ethical academic infrastructures that not only further normative academic work, research, pedagogy, advising, administration, etc., but also intelligently transfers some, though not all, values and practices in both directions between higher education and today's other powerful institutions, business, law, medicine, government, the media, the creative industries, NGOs, and so on, all of whom use information technologies in common but with slight, crucial differences from each other. So the next section of my talk is titled Support Beam 2. This is one more plank of method, although as you'll see, I'm not going to be able to complete the building today. At present, some of the most influential general understandings of infrastructure, as cited, for example, by such digital humanists as Sheila Anderson and James Smithies, who study humanities research cyber infrastructure in particular, include these. One is the large technical systems, LTS approach, descended originally from the historian Thomas Hughes' book Networks of Power in 1983. It's a massively influential book in American studies. And the information ethnography approach stemming from Susan Lee Starr, Jeffrey Bowker, and their group, boundary objects, etc. Good expositions of both are combined in one of the best conceptualizations of infrastructure I've so far found, and that's a document of 2007. Bowker is one of the co-authors, titled Understanding Infrastructure, Dynamics, Tensions, and Design, the final report for an NSF workshop that Bowker and his group were involved in. Supplementing these general approaches to infrastructure, I'm going to propose here, and in my continuing project, these are the approaches I am exploring, 3 other portfolios of thought that, to my knowledge, are largely unknown in the digital humanities, and for that matter, in the humanities as a whole, even though they are broadly compatible with humanities cultural criticism and interpretive work. Because powerful institutions, business, law, medicine, government, the media, and so on, are today the actors that most forcefully innovate systems designed to enmesh cultural experience in infrastructure, we need a good way to study those institutions and their infrastructure. The portfolios of study I suggest thus consist of, first, the neo-institutionalist approach to organizations, which I take from the social sciences. Secondly, the social constructionists, especially as they call it adaptive structuration approaches to organizational technologies, which I take from a combination of the social sciences and information science. That's very consonant with the neo-institutionalists in sociology. And third, the so-called emergent critical maintenance, repair, and care movement, which I take from science, technology, studies. And you'll get a read of what that means if you understand that what they are about is arguing against the fetish of innovation and for that of care, repair, and maintenance. Taken together, these approaches allow us to explore how organizations are structured as social institutions by so-called carriers of beliefs and practices, that is, of culture, among which today information technology infrastructure is increasingly crucial. Importantly, all these approaches are social science or STS versions of what I've called lightly anti-foundationalist. Scholars in these areas see through the supposed rationality of organizations and their supporting infrastructures to the fact that they are indeed social institutions with all the irrationality that implies. But they're less interested in exposing the ungrounded nature of organizations, institutions, and infrastructures, as if it were possible to avoid or get outside them, than in illuminating and pragmatically guiding the agencies and factors involved in their making, remaking, and maintenance. Such approaches are thus inherently a good match for the epistemology of building, unbuilding, and rebuilding in the digital humanities. More than a good match, neo-institutionalism, the social science of organizational technologies, and the STS approach to the theory, practice, and ethos of caring for and repairing existing structures, I think offer exactly the right tactical opening for a digital humanities cultural criticism, because they are all about the site on which the already existing critical force of the digital humanities is pent up, in-place institutional forms of technologically assisted knowledge work. After all, when you think about it, the digital humanities stand in contrast to new media studies and network critique among cousin fields as that branch of digitally focused humanities work that to date has been primarily focused on changing research, curation, authorship, dissemination, and teaching inside academic institutions and related cultural or heritage institutions, rather than on broader commentary directed externally at society and social justice. The digital humanities are all about creating research collections and corpora, developing analytical, publishing, curatorial, and hybrid pedagogical tools, establishing new university programs and centers, changing the accepted notion of academic careers, for example, to include out-act careers, and ultimately instilling a new scholarly digital ethos in the academy in the name of collaboration and open access. As a consequence, the existing critical energy of the digital humanities, sometimes quite passionate and even militant, has been primarily devoted to such institutional issues. Breaking down the paywalls of closed publication infrastructures, for instance, is the digital humanities version of storming a university administration building in the 1970s. I won't be able to complete the argument here, But I think it'd be useful at least to put in place an initial introduction to the first of the three portfolios I've just mentioned, neo-institutionalism, which is the method that helps us frame the question, how do today's so-called knowledge work institutions, not just corporations, but also the higher education institution, know? And how do such knowledge work institutions know on the basis of information technology infrastructures? This is an updated version of the question that Mary Douglas asked in her mid-1980s book, How Institutions Think. Neo-institutionalism addresses such questions. This is the influential approach to organizational institutions that arose among sociologists and organization theorists beginning in the early 1980s. Detailed explications of the method and narratives of its development are available in the so-called Orange Bible, or canonical collection of essays of the group, which came out from Walter Powell and Paul DiMaggio about 10 years after the movement began. This was issued in 1991. Such explications are also available in more recent syntheses or collections, as Richard Scott's work, the Sage Handbook of Organizational Institutionalism, and others, which I flashed on the screen here. I'm going to offer here, toward the close of my talk, only an outsider's outline of neo-institutionalism, intended to make it accessible to humanists, designers, and others. In my redaction, the neo-institutional view of the nature and behavior of organizational institutions may be put in the form of the following sequence of propositions, which I'm going to redact even further to just bullet points for efficiency. First, organizations have an institutional dimension that is not the same as their organizational structures and processes. This is the root axiom of neo-institutionalism, the de-synonymization of institutions from organizations. Two, the institutional dimension of organizations is non-rational and relational, even when, or especially when, organizations appear to be rational in maximizing resources to reach defined goals. In short, neo-institutionalism's answer to the question, how do institutions think, is they don't think, they act like they think. Three, intra-organizationally, institutions are motivated by different combinations of agency enacted by different personnel. You can already begin to see the possibilities for critical leverage and thinking about this here. In particular, neo-institutionalists speak of what they call three pillars of institutional motivation: regulative, normative, and cultural cognitive, that together, but in different ways, impel people to conform to, think in terms of, or take for granted institutional conventions. So roughly translated, regulative means what someone tells you to do, normative means what everyone does, and cultural cognitive means what you've internalized so deeply that it's inconceivable not to be doing that. Four, extra-organizationally, institutions are motivated by the collective behaviors and taken for granted thinking of their organizational field and environment. So this is quite a distinctive new move in sociology. You don't look just at the corporation. You look at all the other corporations related to it in the field to see how they were influenced, for example, by Jack Welch's corporate philosophy at GE. Five, both intra and extra-organizationally, institutionalization tends to be a convergent process. I'm particularly interested in applying this approach to understanding the current pressures placed on higher educational institutions and other so-called soft core institutions by the harder edge institutions with simplified bottom lines, such as corporations, to reach a certain kind of convergence on a corporate model. But six, and this is where the true critical potential lies, neo-institutionalism is about the fact that organizations and organizational fields contain dissonances that can also make institutionalization a divergent process. The fact that the neo-institutionalists have case studies for how particular kinds of sectors of the industry diverge from others is, I think, of crucial interest to those of us in higher education today. Think about the relationship of our institution to those of others in society. So I'm going to move toward my conclusion. If I had more time, I'd lay in this other support beams. Here I'm just going to signal to you what these other portfolios of mine mean by means of a few quotations and citations. So first of all, the social constructionist approach to the study of organizational technologies. Richard Scott puts it this way. Organizational students of technology, he says, earlier treated complex technologies, embodied in both hardware and software, as a unidirectional and deterministic influence impacting organizational structure and behavior. Later theorists reacted by emphasizing the socially constructed nature of technology and the extent to which its effects are mediated by situational factors and interpretive processes. The most important characteristic of artifacts is that they all embody both technical and symbolic elements. Wanda Oldakowski's essay, The Duality of Technology, is perhaps the best known single influence on the field, and she herself is channeling Anthony Giddens' work in the background on adaptive structuration. She puts it this way: technology is the product of human action, while it also assumes structural properties. So that's the paradox. We make technology, but at a certain place, it acquires a kind of a petrified structural force that makes us. That is, technology is physically constructed by actors working in a given social context, and technology is socially constructed by actors through the different meanings they attach to it and the various features they emphasize and use. However, it is also the case that once developed and deployed, technology tends to become reified and institutionalized, losing its connection with the human agents that constructed it or gave it meaning, and appears to be part of the objective structural properties of the organization. It becomes the infrastructure, in other words. Agency and structure are not independent. It's the ongoing action of human agents in habitually drawing on technology that objectifies and institutionalizes it. Thus, if by contrast, agents change the technology physically or interpretively every time they use it, it would not assume the stability and taken for grantedness that is necessary for institutionalization. But such a constantly evolving interaction with technology would, of course, undermine many of the advantages that accrue from using technology to accomplish work. We don't actually need to physically or socially reconstruct a telephone, elevator, or typewriter every time we use it. However, there clearly are occasions where continued unreflective use of a technology is inappropriate or ineffective. While we can expect a greater engagement of human agents during the initial development of a technology, this does not discount the ongoing potential for users to change it physically and socially throughout their interaction with it. In using a technology, users interpret, appropriate, and manipulate it in various ways. That's the opening for critical inquiry there. So just very quickly, this is the STS maintenance, repair, and care movement. A good site to look at is titled Hail the Maintainers, which is kept by two of the leaders of the field, Andrew Russell and Lee Vinsel. Quote, focusing on infrastructure or on old existing things rather than novel ones reminds us of the absolute centrality of the work that goes into keeping the entire world going. We can think of labor that goes into maintenance and repair as the work of the maintainer. I just went to a talk by Lee Vinsel last week. He was at UCSB. This is a bibliography that's mostly his. I've added on to it a little bit. Christopher Hank's work, The Mechanics of Workplace Order Toward a Sociology of Repair. Stephen Jackson is very active in this field. His essay, Rethinking Repair. He is a co-authored essay with Lai-Wu Kang, Breakdown, Obsolescence, and Reuse, HCI, and the Art of Repair. And Jerome Dennis and David Fontiel's work, Material Ordering and the Care of Things. So I'm going to come to my conclusion now, topping the structure. We haven't completed the building today, of course. What we have at best is a plan of research, one of many possible ones that bring the digital humanities in the university into contact with knowledge work in other institutions in a common endeavor of creating, using, evolving, and also thinking critically about infrastructure. It's enough of a plan, perhaps, to provide the platform for me to close by asking this series of critical questions. Can neo-institutional, social structuration of technology, and critical maintenance approaches to understanding the evolving relation between the academic institution in today's more domineering institutions, most notably business and government, help the digital humanities release its intramural critical energy? Can that release help propel not just change in higher education, but through higher education and the technological infrastructures that mediate its relationship to other institutions, also extramural change in the larger society that higher ed contributes to? In short, can the considerable existing intelligence, idealism, and moral force of the digital humanities be redirected from being only an instrument of institution work to becoming, through interventions in instrumental infrastructure, also a way to act on institutions and their wider social impact? But I do not wish to overreach, which is why I also think an approach focused on institutions and their infrastructures is particularly appropriate. Ultimately, the digital humanities field must be critical in a way that does not ask it inauthentically to reach beyond its expertise and mandate to bear exaggerated responsibility for larger social phenomena. Acting out through the digital humanities about larger social issues is necessary, but such actions must be complemented by creating infrastructures and practices that make their social impact, first of all, by being what Susan Lee Starr calls boundary objects. In this case, boundary objects situated between the academic institution and other major social institutions. It's in this boundary zone, just as one example, content management system infrastructures whose use by scholars oscillate between corporate managed and open community philosophies, that higher education can most pertinently influence and be influenced by other institutions to what I earlier called shared but contested information technology infrastructure. It is in this boundary zone of hybrid scholarly, pedagogical, and administrative institutional infrastructure that we need the attention of skilled and thoughtful digital humanists, even if the interventions they make are not called anything as ambitious as activism, but instead simply building, or we can add, maintaining. So I've got a 2-minute coda. What infrastructure means to me, which is actually the title of a 2-minute papers that everyone had to give at a London event that I went to. So this is what infrastructure means to me. And you'll see this is partly personal and partly a whiteboard, blackboard here for incubating some ideas that I'm working on. They're not quite ready for prime time and they're constantly evolving. It's May 3rd, is it? 2013. My Twitter account. Mourn for my dad today at WTC Memorial. Not a 9/11 victim, a chief engineer of Twin Towers. So much of him is here. So a moment in honor of my dad, Ernest T. Liu, 1924 to 2011. One of the chief engineers for the Skilling, Helly, Christensen, Robertson firm, which did the structural engineering for the World Trade Center. The little building that I've been building throughout the talk, the visual elements of that I took from a program for beam support calculation that he was working on after his retirement and before his death, called C-beams. So here are the thoughts I'm incubating. Infrastructure is the concentration of social, economic, military, governmental, corporate, medical, religious, educational, and often also piercingly familial and personal psychological power on an actually or potentially concrete site, where structures are built for these physical or social designs of appropriation or extraction. And there are different synonyms depending on what context or field you're dealing with. Accumulation or storage, transformation or processing, and exchange or transport. These kinds of designs are instrumental in regulating the underlying stresses whose balance is the foundational design of any society, including the stresses of stasis versus change, locality versus globality, hierarchy versus equality. I'm trying very hard here to stay from words like power, and to rethink what power might mean from a repairs and maintenance philosophy of stresses that need to be managed in different kinds of ways. Specific infrastructures are engineered in the forms of, among others, architecture, including land use and city planning, technology, media. For example, the digital consoles ringing the WTC memorial, if you've been there, instances of what my former colleague Lisa Parks calls media infrastructures, material sites and objects involved in the national, local, and/or global audiovisual distribution of signals and data. If you know the story behind the placement of names around the perimeter of the two holes at the WTC Memorial now, the designer behind that, Jer Thorpe and his team, had to create an elaborate algorithmic design interface to place the names, which are not placed alphabetically, as you know, but by association, by locality, by request of families, and also had to be fitted design-wise into the block-like granite slabs or marble slabs there. So it's a very intricate design problem. And the fourth form in which infrastructures are engineered, of course, is the one that I concentrated on today, institutions. I can't recount to you how often my dad came home swearing at the New Jersey and New York Port Authority. In a historical view, modernity and postmodernity have substantially increased the relative importance of the following in infrastructure: hybrid designs of appropriation, accumulation, transformation, and exchange, linkages between technology and media, and the dominance of particular institutional forms, especially the corporation. The gist of this: you know you're in the presence of foundational infrastructure when even where specific structures fail in collision with other infrastructures. For example, the World Trade Center versus the World Air System as co-opted by world terrorism. Revenant structures of architectural, technological, media, institutional, and psychological power rise again to make even the haunting absence of structure, for example, those visually bottomless abysses at the WTC Memorial, the blueprint of new infrastructure. Thanks. Do we have time for any questions?
We sure do. Thank you. Please.
If you have interest in asking questions or commenting or reflecting or just saying something, sometimes at the beginning of a question and answer period, people have a hard time getting over the threshold of a question. So maybe just saying something without needing to manufacture a question would be good too. Yes, in the back.
Well, it's interesting that Campbell book actually, thank you very much for your talk. It blew my mind. But interestingly enough, I'm just sending in the manuscript for a book that talks about exactly these processes in the first half of the 19th century.
Wow.
So, what I sort of want to come back to in terms of the sort of light foundationalism and its implications for rethinking critical attitudes is, it seems to me one of the things that I've described in a book that partly talks about infrastructure and its importance in repositioning people's sense of themselves and actual selves in space and in terms of new collectives and activity, is that one of the things that defines infrastructure as of the 19th century is that it creates new tools that are publicly available for an almost incredible, infinite diversity of private needs.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore unleashes an amount of activity and projects and personal and also collective energy that were just not possible before. So I'm wondering, this really shifts, if you pay attention to that, it really shifts the pressure on users. Like it turns the focus back to the user as not someone who's only oppressed, right? But the narrative, the foundational narrative is tended to revolve around. and has actually kind of shown just how complicated that user role is, both constrained to use given sort of a language and at the same time enabled, right, by all these new structures. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that interaction between the new kind of focus on
Wow, you really opened up a large set of context here, and really crucial. I obviously don't know your field. Well, what is your name, by the way?
I'm Deputy Attorney, and I'm in LCL, and I'm a kind of, I study early math culture, the shift to early math.
And mass society, right, as I recall, I took a look at your description on the university website before I came here. So I'm going to leap into the context that you set up here by means of the word mass and the word mass society, actually, because you're quite right that if you rethink the course of the 20th century to the period that I'm most concerned with here, which I call alternately post-industrialism or late modernity, etc., one of the things you can do is to rethink that period of time from an infrastructural point of view, which gives us a new twist or interpretation of what mass society might mean and what the modern public is. As you point out, it's simply not the case from the infrastructure point of view that mass society is a crowd of almost like uniform automatons who all go home and sit on their couch and turn on the same TV show each night. I Love Lucy, etc., going on from the 1950s. It's also the case that the great foundational infrastructures that made modernity possible made possible the tactical, individual, and often idiosyncratic uses of those technologies. The power of those great public infrastructure projects is the private, in the living room use, which are not always surveillable and not always predictable. That's why you need firms like the Nielsen firm and so on to find out what people are actually doing when they watch a TV program. The equivalent analogy today, at the late part of the 20th century and the beginning part of the 21st, is the great debate we're having about actually what is the relationship of the great foundational online and digital infrastructures today to, on the one hand, mass society, and on the other hand, the individual user. So you'll find the argument argued in both directions, right from the 1970s on, from the era of cyber libertarianism, for example. On the one hand, hooray for the internet. It decentralizes everything and disintermediates everything. Everyone has an individual voice. We're all in the long tail. Let's ignore the power users on the other side of the scale. Hi. So, is that Siri? Yeah. So Siri is involved in this discussion, and would be a very good case study in this context. So that's the cyber libertarian crowd. But of course, on the other side of the room right now, we have people saying, okay, exactly how are the individual uses of technology made possible? They're made possible by the great aggregator, harvester companies. You can name them. They're all, you can count them on the fingers of one hand: Google, Amazon, Apple, and increasingly Microsoft as they move into the cloud as well. So that's the argument that's being made. Again, the internet and these new technologies are great foundational public infrastructures that make possible myriad unpredictable uses, and somehow the notion of the myriad and the notion of the assembled aggregated mass are flip sides of the same coin, or Bitcoin. So I'd love to see that book when it's going to come out soon, I guess. What's the title of the book?
Called Elements of Mass Culture, Paris and the Life of Large Numbers. I did not want to get into the mass culture, the mass term and all of that.
Great.
So
Yeah.
about
Yeah. And by the way, this is a conversation that could be had with many different disciplines that would inflect it differently. I was out at the University of Nebraska a few years ago and had a chance to meet William Thomas, who's one of the leading digital humanists there. And he and his group are very involved in kind of community history and using digital technologies to encourage a kind of what they call history harvest. So they go out and send students out to find what's in the attic, right? And to get the oral history around that artifact or book or massive papers in the attic. And in that way, to encourage a kind of a myriad tactical infusion of crowdsourced digital information into the resources that they create. I think they're creating and reposing things in our Amica backend, but I'm not quite sure. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
Hi, Alan. Tom Scheinfeld.
Hi, I'm so glad you're here and finally to be able to meet you.
Thank you for coming. I'm going to take your invitation to just sort of throw out some words and have you riff on them. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking was the relationship. So we're talking about the relationships between media studies and digital humanities. One of the things in terms of infrastructure in the university organizational context that I often think about is the relationship of digital humanities to educational technology and that infrastructure, ed tech. And I think to people, I think digital humanists are often surprised when people outside digital humanities kind of group us with the people who are running Blackboard. And when you mention things like CMSs as infrastructure, and it seems to me the relationship to like the CMS among the ed tech community is very different than the relationship of the digital humanities community to the CMS. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about the different role in relationship of digital humanities as infrastructure and ed tech as infrastructure at the university.
Yeah. I think the main entry into this topic has to do with scale. There are ways that digital humanists, faculty members, researchers, graduate students, undergraduates, and others in other fields can intervene in the great debates that are occurring right now having to do with ed tech scale technologies, but it's very difficult for reasons of scale. So let me give you a sense of this. My small little example about the use of content management systems pales in this regard unless you scale it up. I serve on the university committee. It's called the Information Technology Council in my institution that is the university level body in charge of vetting, researching, and making recommendations to the administrators about the multi-million-dollar enterprise scale technology projects to which the university wants to commit itself. So I'm very conscious of the kinds of debates that we've been having right now about projects at that scale, some of which include the ed tech kinds of projects. But even ed tech, I have to say, takes a back seat to the priority projects for great university systems right now. And these are the non-core mission needs of a university. Non-core in the sense that they're not research-oriented, they're not pedagogy-oriented, but they are immediately needed for the reason that, for example, people want their paychecks on time. So you need to upgrade and migrate your entire payroll system or your human resource and management system or the calendaring system on campus. These tend to have price tags in the millions of dollars and above, and timeline developments of 10 years, 15 years, and so on. As a consequence, that is where the university is putting its greatest amount of attention, expertise in terms of the technical staff, and of course dollar investments as well. Taking a back seat to that are ed tech scale kinds of projects. In fact, my university is incredibly backward in terms of signing on to any kind of a centralized, Blackboard type teaching content management system. We're now using a kind of improvised version of a Moodle that we've developed ourselves. And taking even a further back seat, so far back that it's not even attached to the train anymore, is any kind of project that has to do with research and pedagogy. So before we even get there, we begin to talk about things like campus networking, the physical networking of the campus, et cetera, all the things that are required to move big data sets around. Then we talk about data repositories and management and sustainability policies. And then we talk about research and pedagogy. So to give you a concrete instance of the debates that universities like mine are having right now, you may very well be having these kinds of debates. We, like many other universities, have been going through a study period and an experiment period to decide whether we are going to commit to a migration to the Google Ask for Education cloud ecosystem, or the alternative would be the Microsoft 365 cloud ecosystem, as if the universe were completely parsed between those two empires with no remainder in between. Google has won out in our case. All of that is being driven by discussions of back-end support needs, email, calendaring, the robustness of that, et cetera. There's absolutely no discussion about what signing on to these ecosystems might mean 5 years down the road. When people realize that, for example, hey, since we signed on to Google, why not also their Google Classroom and other research or pedagogically oriented services here? All of that is not being strategized because it's not, we're dealing first at levels of scale with more immediate kinds of issues. I don't know whether I've answered your question. All I've provided here is a kind of a framing of the space in which we need people who have some kind of digital humanities expertise to intervene. And not just digital humanists, but librarians, people from the museum world and others who need to be there right now when the page is still blank to say, hey, look, 10 years down the road, if we want to have a major presence in research in the world or in pedagogy, we're going to need these kinds of support services for our repositories. How is that going to dovetail with the system that you're putting in place now? Okay, yeah. Yes?
Discussing the Google versus Microsoft angle of projects, of course, at UConn, we have this bizarre system whereby the student, the graduate student, email server is run by Google, and the faculty and the administrative staff servers are run by Microsoft. I have both right now in a sort of hybrid administrator-student role. And this makes me think about this idea of collision that you brought up at the end, and I'm looking at my point Alex, exactly what I'm saying now, which is this like Caroline Levine and I'm thinking about a collision between similar forms, different types of forms. How much does Levine's theory of forms have to do with this kind of critical infrastructure studies, do you think?
It can be made to bear quite a bit on it. I was with her at a conference recently and mentioned some aspect of this issue this morning at my meeting with some of you graduate students and Charles and Yohai. I think the interesting pair of words to think about in this regard are the pair of words structure and form. Structure is at the root of the word infrastructure, of course. What I said this morning was something like this in that informal setting. I said that you can think of structure as something that sits there and has a kind of independent existence and independent agency aside from you. That's what the social historian's approach to technology is, that at a certain point, the engineering processes and the design processes cede to the structural properties of the technologies that they create. Now, in Caroline Levine's vocabulary, which is very important to her, she borrows it from the design field, which itself borrowed it from, the cognitive scientist Jay Gibson's work. In her vocabulary, that means that structures come complete with a certain set of affordances. The affordances already constrain you from the beginning in terms of what you can do with them and what you can't do with them. The word form, by distinction with structure, has a different tonality and connotation. As I put it this morning, it's very hard to work with forms except in an active process of performing them, reforming them, transforming them, and sometimes deforming them. If you know Lisa Samuel and Jerome McGann's essay on deformance in literature, that's where that last phrase comes from. That is, there's no form that just sits there by itself in the same way a structure sits there or is presumed to sit there by itself. A form isn't formed, rendered, as we say in the information technology world, until the script, the code, the program for it is actually performed. So the code needs to be read and projected onto the screen for the form, as it were, to take place. Critical work today goes right back to that seam in between the scripted structure on the one hand and the rendered form on the other. So much of what we do in education from K-12 on has to do with navigating back and forth between structured programmatic scripts on the one hand and performed renderings on the other. So think about it this way. What does teaching literacy consist of from grade K through grade, 3 or 4? It consists of teaching children to navigate in one direction from the very, very difficult script to the rendered performance. So learn to read and learn to internalize that reading so that you can read the script, very difficult programmatic code after all on the page, in a way that is naturally rendered as thinking in your mind. And then what does teaching literacy consist of from about grade, 5, 6, 7, certainly in our classes in college on? It means going in the opposite direction often. It means, okay, now you know how to read a novel by turning the pages from first word to second word and so on. Now let's go backward and reverse engineer and go back to the code, to the script, and see how it could be improved, reshuffled, remixed, something done with it. So we're teaching children to move back and forth between that structured program on the one hand and the performed version or the rendered version on the other. Whatever the critical act is, it's there hand in hand with the performative act. In fact, that's one of the things that Samuels and McGann say in their elegant essay, which begins with, Emily Dickinson thinking to herself, asking the question, have you ever read a poem backwards? It's one of the things that Samuels and McGann say, which is that the true critical act is also a performative act and vice versa. And somehow, since the beginning of the 20th century, since the great avant-garde movements of the beginning of the 20th century, we've lost touch with the contact that needs to be made between the performative and the hermeneutic side of critical endeavors. They're trying to put that back together again. Okay, I've taken many stops along the way and detoured. Yes, Ashley.
Just a question related to the field of discipline of humanities, and maybe there's a one-word answer to that. So are you saying that the hermeneutics of digital humanities is infrastructure?
No, I'm saying that's one of the possible avenues that is most opportune to explore. So, as I put it at the beginning of this talk, I think we can probably, if we sat down in a room together and voted on this, we could probably come up with 3, 4, or 5 really attractive sweet spots to think about in terms of what should be our critical objects. Critical objects that also have the potential to serve as thinking instruments. So they're not just objects we think about, but objects we begin to think about other things through. I think infrastructure is one of these objects/instruments of thinking. It's important to society, and it offers special opportunities to digital humanists in particular to think about. But as I also mentioned, I would nominate also big data. And I would nominate algorithmic culture, as it's sometimes been called. Probably, the kind of work that maybe you and Anki work on, that Anki calls the multimodal, would be another such interesting sweet spot for research. If we really think through what it would involve to do digital humanities work that is like new media studies work and vice versa. Despite the technical challenges of not being able to do natural language processing on the same way with images or sound, etc. After all, there are people like Tanya Clement who are working with sound in very interesting ways in her HIPSTAS project that go back and forth between the digital humanities and new media studies. So that's what I'm saying, that there are a number of possible opportunities. I think that infrastructure studies is a particularly important one that could be developed. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I'm sorry for coming in late. I was super excited about this, and we had an oral exam that went over. Apologize. My name is Jason Chang, in History and Asian American Studies. I'm a historian of race and state power in the 19th and 20th century. One of the things I'm interested in, I'm new to this field, but I'm wondering how you would, and maybe you did this earlier in the presentation, so forgive me, but I'd like to know how you think about infrastructure studies as a way of looking at how the human is defined. And partially in response to Jennifer's question about the user, in some ways the infrastructure envisions the user, envisions the human in a particular fashion. But I'd like to know if there's, if we were to write a history of race from infrastructure, what would that story tell us?
Okay.
So I'll leave it there.
Okay. It's a fabulous topic, a very rich one. So I'm going to go at this way, and it won't be a complete answer, of course. I think the answer has got to be antithetical in this sense. So the thesis here is this, that often those people in society who are marked racially, ethnically, by gender or otherwise, are those who are perceived as being more or less agentless in the presence of powerful foundational infrastructures. Now, you can marry this thought to Foucault's notion of heterotopia and sites in what he calls other spaces in that fugitive essay of his, where he says that the kind of space fetishization that we have today is about powerful places, and increasingly spaces that are not ritualistic or sacred in the old sense, but in modern societies what he terms other spaces or heterotopias because they are quote-unquote deviant spaces, or spaces that are for the containment of deviance in one form or another. So for Foucault, as you know, the great infrastructures are the penitentiary, the schoolroom, the asylum, et cetera. So one thesis would be this. It might even be said that you are not racialized, marked as racialized, or in some other way made minoritarian, unless you are conceived of as being put in a box by an infrastructure that someone else controls the key for. In fact, powerful infrastructures are a sign of an interface with, as it were, the racialized subject. So Angels Island off of San Francisco comes to mind with your race and mine, those famous prisoners who were kept there for indeterminate lengths of time, awaiting clearance to enter the country, scrawling their poems on the walls. I mean, it's a fabulous case of media, history, and infrastructure all in one there. So that's the thesis. Now the antithesis. I don't think it is satisfying to conceive of racialized others, as it were, as solely contained objects within infrastructure. You also have to look at the other side and see the agency they had on the making of infrastructures. Now, a superficial sign of that is, in fact, the wall poems. Those poems themselves are now an object of curation. They are reason for keeping that infrastructure alive. They have more agency now than, of course, than they had in the past. But in the case of your race and mine, I think that something that has not been written about or researched very much is this kind of an invisible presence of the immigrants in this nation behind our information technologies. So if you look at who the engineers are, who made Google, who made Amazon, who made Microsoft, a great number of them, not all, obviously, are people from Asia, from South Asia as well. And they, so far, from what I've seen, they have no place in our discourse about digital humanities, media studies, or anything else. They're the engineers in the other room. We talk about the interfaces, we talk about the hermeneutics, we talk about the cultural implications, and occasionally we call them in to get the program to work or to do the visualization for us. What would a project look like that granted the engineers, including all the racialized engineers in this world, in our country, a place at the table as an equal in the conceptualization of a project, in the execution of a project, in the thematization of a project, as part of the object of the project, and not just as a backroom innovator of it. So that's my antithetical question to you.
It makes me think of all the tech companies who signed on to the stay on the executive order. What came to mind as you were talking, I'm sorry to take up, also it seems to me there's the engineered absence of infrastructure. Super ghettos, for instance, hyper ghettos, where infrastructure is removed from places as a means of racialization.
Oh, it's very interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
So, thank you.
Hey, we've got a special issue of some journal, percolating here. So, that's probably enough time. No,
Yes.
thank you all for coming.